Mic check. Mic check. Mic check. Mic check. Mic check. and SPP, and this is regarding Missouri Utilities resource adequacy for fall 2024 and winter 2024-2025. Good morning, I'm Ron Pridgeon. I'm the regulatory law judge assigned to preside over this public meeting. It's August 14th, 2024 in the Governor Office Building in Jefferson City, Missouri. The time is 10 a.m. A couple of announcements before I proceed. Because this is not a contested case, or indeed even a case at all, while you're welcome to have counsel to participate, it is not required. Also, I would ask people participating on WebEx to please mute their microphones unless they plan to speak, and that will minimize or prevent any sort of feedback or technical trouble. I do want to kind of go over a roadmap on how I would like to proceed and open it up for questions, and then we'll see if the commissioners have any opening statements. I do want, again, the commissioners to have the opportunity to make some opening statements for this meeting, and after that we will proceed to presentations from our RTOs. I would like to proceed first with MISO, and then after MISO has made a presentation, see if we have any questions from commissioners, and then any questions from staff, public counsel, or utilities. And then we will do the same thing for SPP. SPP will make a presentation, and then we'll see if we have any questions from staff, public counsel, or utilities. And then we'll see if we have any closing remarks from the bench. Does anyone have any questions before we receive opening remarks from the commissioners? All right, hearing none. Chair Hahn, any opening remarks?
Sure. Thank you, Judge. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming. This is the first hearing of this kind at the Missouri Public Service Commission, but I think it's time for this kind of hearing. And following on our conversations from yesterday, it seems like we need to be engaged with our RTOs, and we need our RTOs to be engaged with one another about what is happening, and especially with Missouri having several SEAMS issues. I think this might be a great forum in which we can further facilitate those conversations. So I appreciate everyone for hanging in with us for 2 to 3 days, and I know that it is for those that already travel a lot, an extra commitment, but I'm so thankful you're here and look forward to facilitating and coordinating this conversation. Thank you so much.
Chair Hahn, thank you. Commissioner Coleman?
Judge, I concur with the chairman's statements, so I'm all good. Glad you all are here.
Commissioner Coleman, thank you. Commissioner Holzman?
Thank you. Just want to thank you for coming today. This important conversations. It seems like we spend a lot of time in the RTO world. The seams that we have between SPP and MISO are very important to our state, particularly. And the resource capacity inadequacy is something that is a challenge that we have in front of us. And we start with these conversations to try to solve it. My hope is that these conversations will then turn into some concrete and some realistic steps that our companies can do and our RTO can do, and we can help support that to where we're not 5 years from now having the same conversation. I'd like to have something done in the next 3 years that says in 5 years we're good. So I appreciate you being here to have that conversation. Thank you.
Commissioner, thank you. Commissioner Coltmeyer?
Thank you, Judge. Yes, I want to just echo what the previous commissioners have said. I want to thank Chairwoman Hahn for bringing this to the forefront and getting this in front of all of us. It's very important for what we're to see down the road. Several of us are very concerned about the future of reliability down the road. So here again, thank you for coming, and thank you for having this conversation with us today.
All right, Commissioner, thank you. I don't believe Commissioner Mitchell is on WebEx, but just in case, Commissioner Mitchell. All right. Do we have a presentation from MISO?
Thank you. If we could pull up my slide deck, I think I want to pop around in that to do that. Let's go. Can we go to slide 10 first, please, in the deck? Yep, that's perfect. Thank you. Before I get started, I want to thank the chair and everybody. Yesterday was a wonderful presentation. Talk about learning something. I learned something new every day. And once you stop doing that, you have a problem. And we did learn a little bit yesterday. So thank the commission and really thank the commission staff. I mean, they worked really hard to put this together. I know the people that work for me do all the hard work, and I'm very appreciative of what they do. But I also want to talk a little bit about our relationship with SPP. We may not talk every day, but the people that control the grid do talk every day. And they work together, and we will continue to work together because our job of both RTOs is to make sure everybody has their lights on when they wake up in the morning and when they go to bed at night, their lights are still on. So there's a lot of communication between SPP and us. I know John, Bear, and Barbara talk regularly to make sure that we're working through things, especially when we both talk about this, especially as we continue to work on JTIQ, which has been a phenomenal project and something other RTOs could to work on, to take a lead on. So I guess the most important thing is we're here to just sort of set the stage, and I'm not sure how to work this. Yeah, I hit the wrong button already. There it is. I think I'll just sort of set the stage of why we're here. This is sort of the deck that we utilized yesterday. I'm going to hop back and forth on this in a second. But first, for the people on the phone, this is Bob Kuzman, Executive Director for the Central Region of MISO, which makes up of Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Missouri, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and responsible for the day-to-day operations from the governor's office all the way down through our stakeholders such as Ameren and all our other munis and co-ops throughout the great state of Missouri. But I think where I want to start is sort of this, if I missed the slide. There it is. So I think what got everybody's sort of attention and why this began the discussion is what happened in Missouri in the MISO footprint. As you can see from this slide, prior to this year in 2023, we had a roughly surplus of about 2,435 megawatts. You can see the increased LCR, which is a local clearing requirement. It means every zone that we have in MISO must have so much generation located within that zone. And after that, they can import as much as they would like. You can see what happened with the retired coal, and I love flow charts like this that just got taken away from me, but it'll come back up here in a second. There it is. Retired coal of about 1,128 megawatts. POs stand for planned outages, and then some higher credit value, and we became a deficit in the fall of 872, which sent our prices to cost of new entry in that area. I think a couple things with that, that's why it happened and why we're here. A couple things I want to talk a little bit about is that some of the problems can be solved by what's in our generation interconnection queue. You can see that there are 50 projects that are in the queue right now, color-coded by which type of resource those are. And in Missouri, I think there's roughly 2.3 gigawatts of new signed generation interconnection agreements, but no steel in the ground or moving forward. Obviously, those will solve that problem if those projects are implemented or online by next year or in the coming years to help solve the problem of not meeting your local clearing requirement. But we're also dealing with what we talked about yesterday, not only what we see in the last auction, but also the rapid addition of growth of as I hit too many buttons, there we go. As the rapid addition of new load growth resulting for obviously robust economic development, which is important for Missouri and important for the people that live here to create jobs. So we're seeing a large increase in data centers, manufacturing, increased cooling demands, electric vehicles, and cryptocurrency. Really interesting what AECI said about the heat pumps yesterday and how that affects. You learn something that every day, and I'm sure that affects the members in Ameren and everybody else down the line too, just not AECI. So you see that large growth. So the bottom line is what MISO has been talking about is let's all take a deep breath. Let's look at the resources that we have online, the ones that we can keep online. And as we learn more about carbon capture, battery storage, hydrogen. Let's just take a slow play on what we're retiring. Now, if you're retiring something and changing it for the same attributes or the same accreditation, that's perfect. If you want to add some non-thermal resources, that's great because that's a great energy source. But you also need those thermal resources as capacity. And as one thing, and I'll stop talking here in a second and turn this over to SPP. I think one thing I do want to talk about as we go to the future, I'm going to go back to slide 1, which is a very important slide, if I can get there, that I did not show yesterday. And I think the question to AECI about accreditation of resources. And this is important as we go forward. As everybody knows, and I said this yesterday, reliability is MISO's responsibility. Resource adequacy is the state's or the commission's responsibility. So as we go forward, looking at accreditation for MISO, these are all projected numbers, excuse me, and also if FERC approves our filing that we have in front of them. They did issue a deficiency letter. We're hoping to answer that deficiency letter, and hopefully FERC can still approve our filing by Q4 of 2024, which total full implementation into 2028 to 2029 auction. And let me just walk through that, this chart. If you look at it, what we're doing is changing the way we accredit our resources. We talked about the key to a capacity auction is good accredited resources. When are they going to show up, and if they're going to show up? So we look at sort of a direct loss of load, and we match that with class average. So we have separated each type of fuel unit, gas, nuke, run to water, hydro, pump storage, into different classes. So we look at that as a combination. So we look forward, look forward in the class average, and then I'll look back how they performed those units during the risk hours, when we need you. So if you look at what we are credited wind for in 23-24, it's about 13%. What does that mean? So on a 100 megawatt wind farm, you're getting about 13 capacity megawatts. And vice versa, you can see as we go, it goes down each year in the summer. You can see solar presently, and what the accreditation will be. And then you can see dispatchable or thermal resources, what they will be in the summer. Look at the winter, and I think AECI summed this up very interesting yesterday when they don't accredit solar in the winter. Our accreditation is 1%, 1%, and maybe 2%. Again, a great energy source, just not a great capacity resource. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'm sure we'll get those in a little bit. But I'll go ahead and pass on over to Mr. Kelly and let him go on.
Sir, yeah, when you're ready, I'd like to hear from SPP, and then we'll see if we have any questions. Thank
Okay,
you.
fair enough. And I don't have any slides today, but I do have a few opening remarks I would like to make. And first of all, I'd like to thank Chair Hahn and the rest of the commission for inviting myself and SPP to be a part of this really important conversation. Just by way of introduction, my name is David Kelly. I'm the Vice President of Finance and Chief Financial Officer at SPP. If you're wondering why you're hearing from a finance person about resource adequacy, I was most recently the Vice President of Engineering up until May of this year. This topic of resource adequacy is, you cannot attend any industry forum these days and not talk about resource adequacy. It has now been identified as one of SPP's highest corporate risks, and I can attest to the fact that there is almost no stone being left unturned in order for us to make sure that we identify the policies necessary to ensure that we can protect reliability, not just today, but also into the future. So much so that just last week we issued a paper called our Generational Challenge. And this generational challenge to us reflects a lot of the concepts and facts that you all heard yesterday during the presentations about increasing load, a changing resource mix, and declining reserve margins. Certainly within SPP, we've seen significant changes in our resource mix. We now have over 34,000 megawatts of wind capacity in our region. And by the way, we cover 14 states, serve over 18 million customers in our footprint. And so having over 34,000 megawatts of wind is a significant operational challenge, but it's also presenting issues related to resource adequacy. As my colleague just pointed out, that all megawatts are not created equal. So when we talk about how do we count on certain types of resources to be there, can we depend on them when Winter Storm Uri type events or Winter Storm Elliott events come about? Can we count on those generators to be there to meet demand when our operators need them to be there? These past winter storm events like Elliott and Winter Storm Uri have certainly raised the level of awareness for us to need to, like I mentioned earlier, establish some new policies. And so we have established a resource and energy adequacy leadership team that it is comprised of both commissioners, some of our members and board members, and they have spent the last 18 months or so really focused on where does our planning reserve margin and resource accreditation policies need to be in order to protect reliability. Just last week, the Regional State Committee, based on a recommendation from that REAL team, did approve an increase to SPP's planning reserve margins. So the summer reserve margin will now be 16%, increase from 15%, and we're for the first time establishing a new winter planning reserve margin as well. And that is slated to be 36% beginning in 26-27, the winter of 26-27. I'll conclude my opening remarks just by sort of reflecting on a comment that I heard yesterday from my good friend Roger Clark at ACI. He made the comment that reliability is a team sport, and I thought that was just really well stated. When I think about the role that SPP and all of the RTOs and the members and the regulators and even federal policymakers that we all play in making sure that we have a future that we can count on having a resource mix that we can count on to keep the lights on is so important, and we all have a role to play. And I look forward to your questions to explore those relationships a little better. Thank you.
Mr. Kelly, thank you. Let me see if we have any bench questions. Chair Hunt.
I do. One of the topics that was somewhat addressed yesterday was the interconnection queue timelines and queue reforms to some extent. I was hoping that each of you could talk me through your queue timeline. I know yesterday the specific timeline wasn't given, but I know that hearing from my LREs, they are quite concerned about the study timelines and what's being done to address it. And I know each of you are taking steps, but I'm hoping to get a little bit more concrete direction on those steps and then timelines for those steps too. So,
thank you, Chair Hahn, for the question. Just by way of background, SPP has been trying to clear what we've affectionately called, I guess, an interconnection queue backlog for a number of years, and that started back in 2017. I mentioned that we have added, we are now up to over 34,000 megawatts of wind capacity in our footprint. There were a number of changing federal policies that sort of incentivized that flood of requests into our queue beginning in the 2017 period. And just admittedly, our processes weren't ready for the influx of requests that we saw. So we spent the better part of the next year and a half working with our stakeholders to develop changes to our queue processes that we've called the Backlog Clearing Plan. We filed that plan with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in late 21 and received approval to begin implementing it in 2022. So along that same horizon, while we were working on queue reform, we continue to accept requests. And so that led to a backlog of 7 generator interconnection clusters leading all the way up to the 2022 cluster by the time we actually implemented the reforms. So fortunately, FERC did grant SPP's request for the queue reforms, and so we've spent the last 2 years, 22 through where we sit today, working on clearing those 7 backlogged clusters. I'm happy to report that we had set a goal of clearing those original 7 clusters by the end of this year, and we are on track to do that. But also along those same timelines, we have not stopped opening the door to business. So we've continue to accept new requests. So we also have a 23 and a 24 cluster as well that we are also processing, and we expect to have those processed by the end of next year. So I'll say all that to say we've really crammed about 7 years worth of interconnection requests in the last 2 years worth of study work that we're doing. That has led to where we sit today of having over 24,000 megawatts of generation that is through the interconnection queue and now has signed interconnection agreements and are in various stages of development. With all that said, we know we're not where we need to be. We've also set a corporate goal to be able to process interconnection requests in a span of 12 months. Now, we're not there yet. We do hope to be there by the end of next year. And so we're implementing a lot of automation, new tools and technology. We've hired new staff, training and development. All of those things are leading to shortened timelines. And I know we'll probably get into transmission planning a little deeper later, but I also want to point out that SPP is moving towards a consolidated planning process where we would do our generator interconnection studies in concert with our long-range transmission plan. So each year when we deliver a transmission plan, that would also come along with it the granting of interconnection service. We're still a couple of years out at least from being able to implement that, but we've got a lot of momentum behind it. So I'll turn it over to my colleague to speak from the MISO perspective.
Very similar comments, but I'll sort of walk through our queue, what we have done over the last year, and what we intend to do by the end of this year also. Our goal also is to have, once we get all these reforms, a 1-year queue process. We have started working with our transmission owners who do our studies on figuring out ways to bring technology in to do our initial studies faster so we can start turning that queue over. Our TO groups have been very cooperative in working to solve this problem together. So let's back up to our queue right now. Right now, our queue has 349 gigawatts in it. That's a lot to study. 2, almost 3 times is what our peak load is. So last year we filed at FERC, and our queue is still open too. Our 2022 queue had about 171 gigawatts. And then because of the reforms we filed last year, we had about a 30% reduction in the 2023 cycle. What were those reforms? Those reforms were more acquiring land up front to make sure they actually have the land, including tie lines to where they have to go. We took a lesson from SPP and utilized some of what they utilized in either acquiring that land or pay some dollars to into the fund to say you will have that land. We also included withdrawal penalties and also raised the cost to get in the queue. And we saw about a 30% reduction. Now, when we say the queue has 349 gigawatts, only about 15 to 20% of that will actually become online. So what do we have to do about that? We are continuing to work, and we have ongoing stakeholder process today to take a look at back up a second. Part of our 2023 reforms were caps. How much can you put in so we can at least get through that queue and be able to study it legitimately and move those resources? And FERC rejected the cap, but gave MISO some good guidelines and a way to come back at it and take a look at it, which we're doing now. So in our stakeholder process as we speak, we're working to look to a way to create a queue process that will deal with some of the backlog that we have Two, how do we implement a cap so that we don't get these large queue projects that probably won't come to fruition anyways? So we can move the ones that really are important, i.e. the ones in IRPs, the ones that are needed for load growth. They could be renewables or they can be thermal resources, depending on the states that we serve. But we need to find a way to get those projects online as quickly as we possibly can. The other thing we need is to have the 50 gigawatts of generation that have signed interconnection agreements to start building or complete, or say you're not going to do it and allow somebody else to replace that as we study those transmission lines or those improvements. So those are all things that we're trying to do. Yes, it is a mess right now, but that's part of the transition I think we've both seen as we see the change in fuel types in our systems. I mean, our queues are about 49% solar. So are all those projects going to happen? Most likely not. So hopefully by the end, in the next couple of years, our corporate goals are to have the queue down to 1 year.
Just to follow up a little bit on SPP, you had talked about how you continued to accept projects while you were working through some of the process improvements. My understanding is there is a proposal on the table to also stop accepting projects next year so you can work through process improvements. Can you give me a timeline for when that might be brought to fruition? When would RSC or the board see that? Give me some kind of timeline.
Yeah, actually, at the board meeting that took place last week, the board approved SPP to file a waiver for our tariff that would include delaying the closure of the currently open 2024 cluster. So that there's a window open today that customers can submit requests into that, per our tariff, is scheduled to close later this year. So without a FERC waiver, we would need to close that and then open another one. So what the board authorized us to do is to request the extension of that currently open window. I believe that was to about the February-March timeframe next year. And then to suspend the opening of the 2025 cluster while we work to transition to what I spoke about earlier, is the consolidated planning process. So we would expect that to take place next year, and of course pending FERC approval.
Thank you. So many topics. Where to go next? Planning reserve margin affects all of our utilities, and yesterday we heard, for planning for 2030, we're already behind. At SPP last week, I was part of the committee that helped raise the planning reserve margin requirement, and more to come, right? It's likely that will increase. But I am also hearing from our LREs from a planning perspective that they already need to know for 2029 and 2030 and beyond. They need some level of certainty or stability on what they can expect in the future. But also what I heard was that will just be discussed in October, but really won't even come to RSC until next winter. And so I feel like we're even getting further behind. Can you provide any context for how we get ahead of this a little bit better and how we can provide some certainty to our LREs?
Sure. I'd be happy to try to address that, Chair Hahn. So the conversations last week were heard loud and clear by SPP leadership that our members need a long-term signal for what the planning reserve margin will look like in the future. So we have put together a steering team. I'm not exactly sure what acronym we will probably assign to it, right? But it will be very senior leadership from the RSC, from the board of directors, and from SPP, including some representation from our members. So we're sort of borrowing from the success that we've seen from the REAL team. And the charge there will be to focus on how do we deliver on what our members are asking for. I will say that back to the comment on reliability being a team sport, how we determine what the long-term needs of the region are is also a team sport. When we do these evaluations for what the planning reserve margin needs to be, it depends heavily on having some, not certainty, but confidence in the data and the plans that our members have. And that includes both projections for load growth, generation retirement, new generation that is planning to come online. And so when you look out to say 29, 2030, or even beyond, I mean, it's a complete uncertainty to some degree, right? And so you have to make assumptions and do bookend type analysis to say, this is what it could be as high as some number. And there's probably some mid-range confidence level as to what all of those variables may look like. But ultimately, you deliver a projection of what the planning reserve margin needs to look like, and then the members sort of need to take that as the signal that this is the direction that the planning reserve margin is going. It won't be certainty, because we don't really have certainty as to what the portfolio or the fleet will look like even 2 or 3 years from now. But the best we can do is to make sure that as good and quality data that we can get from our members, we can put that into our analysis and provide those projections. In fact, we did that with the 2023 LOLE study that led to the recommendation on the reserve margin that the RC just approved. It included some assessment of what the 2029 value would look like. So the question is, how do we get from where we are today to getting something that the members can have more confidence in, and honestly that the regulators then could use to authorize the construction and recovery of additional generation resources from our LREs. So there is an intense focus on this issue, and more to come to the RC and the board in the next round of meetings.
Just add on to David's comments, Kim O'Gwen, SPP. So next week, the real team will be meeting. Longer-term PRM projection is on the agenda, and so the topic will be discussed probably from here until the RSC next quarterly meeting. And so I encourage you to either follow the meetings or at some point, your staff is there and participate in those meetings as well. But we will keep you updated and provide education for the RSC up until the point it comes to the RSC for a vote.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Clearly, resource accreditation also impacts all of this. Both of you have a significant amount of projects in the queue in Missouri, but if you could speak to whether those projects in the queue in Missouri will actually have a notable impact on accreditation, will it move the needle or not, given that they are largely intermittent resources, that would be helpful.
I'll go ahead and start first. I think the interesting thing about, I'm going to use a quote from my dad. He said, "Don't put all your eggs in one basket." So different resources provide different attributes and different types of capacity or energy, right? So thermal and also renewable energy is good. It should be a mix as we go forward, and as you see IRPs coming forward, I'm sure you're going to see both thermal and non-thermal generation. Mind you that the non-thermal generation is good for the rates to the customers because of the cost of that electricity, right? It may not be a great train of thought interrupting, but
No.
I'll start. So what we see in the queue, you're right, is non-thermal resources. But what you also have to remember in the MISO queue, and I don't know about the SPP queue, if you're using replacement generation, i.e. a coal plant retiring and being converted to gas, those do not have to come to the queue, and those won't show up in our results. So if a utility is replacing some of their coal units with gas units that are the same attributes, what it is, you won't see that come through our queue. I suggest that as you look at IRPs and CPCNs as you come through, I think a good mix of both thermal and non-thermal generation is something that should be utilized. It's good for the consumer, but it also provides that good capacity that we need and a high accredited value that will show up as we need it in the future. I mean, the bottom line is that we talked about the attributes yesterday a little bit. So what are we looking for in attributes at MISO? Quick start, ramping capabilities both up and down, and voltage control. Those are the attributes that we're looking for and we're trying to encourage at MISO.
Thank you, Chair Hahn. Directly to your question, all resources matter, and all resources can impact the ability for our regions to reliably serve load. Specifically to Missouri, I was just looking at some of the statistics we have available to us in our queue. It looks like we have about 824 megawatts of generators that are through the study process. So they have signed interconnection agreements in various stages of development. All of that is comprised of intermittent generation, primarily solar, some wind, and some batteries. When I look at what's under active study in Missouri, there's a little over 6,000 megawatts that is in the queue. Again, almost exclusively intermittent renewable resources, mostly solar. Looks like about 2,300 megawatts of solar, 2,200 megawatts of battery storage, 925 megawatts of hybrid, which would be a battery coupled with solar or wind site, and then 752 megawatts of additional wind under study. So I could not agree more with my colleague here that a diverse generation resource mix is what all of our regions need for the foreseeable future. That's why accreditation is so important to your question earlier, and why we focus so much on the actual performance of generators to be there when we can count on them to serve demand. Just to throw some additional numbers at you, when we look at our studies, wind on average is about 14% capacity value during the summer and about 25% during the winter. Solar today is sitting at around 59% during the summer and 10% during the winter. So obviously the operating characteristics of the different technologies drive what accreditation value that they get. And when you think of resources like a natural gas plant or a coal or a nuclear plant, you have much more certainty on the fuel being there than you do with wind or solar. But those same generators can be challenged during extreme events, as we learned during Winter Storm Uri and subsequent storms. So that's why we focused on sort of a performance-based accreditation when we look at conventional generation types, to make sure that we're incentivizing and sending the right signals that plant operators actually winterize their plants and do other maintenance such that those plants can be there when we need them the most. So hopefully that answers your question.
It does, thank you. I do have more questions, but before I do that, I would like to open it up to other commissioners for questions, just to make some rounds. Commissioner Coleman?
We have no questions.
Commissioner Holzman?
Yes, I have just a few. Thank you. So for a decade now, we've been talking about the importance of that firming up technology arriving to the market to take intermittency out of the equation for the adequacy capacity factors. Do you believe that at this point, for my two-part question, one, how far away do you predict that technology will be readily available? And do you believe that the ratepayers should participate in helping move that technology towards discovery? Is there a role for the ratepayer to incentivize, for commissions through the ratepayer to incentivize the companies to accelerate the development of storage and other, dispatchable firming up technology?
I'll go first. How's that? Thanks, I appreciate that. You're welcome. Let the young guy do it, right? A couple comments on that. I think that is a decision, and as a former elected official, I understand you're asking me a question about what this commission should do and should not do.
Well, all commissions. I mean, just it's
Sure.
a macro question.
Sure, sure. You have to, as commissioners, judge what's beneficial and good for your ratepayers. So if there's a project out there that could be something that's experimental, if you think that is something that is good for your ratepayers and something good for the economy and for Missouri, I think that's something, or any commission would have to take a look at it. On the issue of technology, what we're seeing is that there are a lot of, especially battery, right now, you have the 4-hour battery, that's probably all you have. But there are some companies within MISO that are looking at 8-hour batteries or longer that are actually trying to become commercially ready to go. When is that date? I don't have an answer to that. I mean, if you harken back to batteries, we were the reason we moved this way is we look for something for light, easy to utilize in vehicles. Some of the other types of battery storage aren't designed that way that could last for 8 hours, 10 hours, and 12 hours. So I know there are companies, I think Excel and a few others inside the MISO footprint that are looking at long-term storage batteries to get there. One of the issues that we have at MISO is that carbon capture. Is it there yet? Not commercially proved yet. Is there hydrogen? Yes, they're working on it. I'm sure there's places that are blending hydrogen now a little bit into the gas to try to deal with that. But until those resources are proven commercially, let's take a deep breath on what we're retiring. So we make sure we say resource adequate throughout the MISO footprint. But they're coming. I don't know. Small modular nuclear is. I'm sure there's a lot of places. I know Purdue University in Indiana is working very closely with some of our utilities to come up with a way to make small modular nuclear units valuable to resources. But right now, they're not there yet either. So, Commissioner, I hope I answered your question. But I'll turn it over to David, and maybe he can do a better job than me.
No, I don't think I'm going to do a better job. But Commissioner, I do appreciate the fact that you teed this up with asking for our opinion. I think that implies maybe there's not a wrong answer here. So I agree with Bob that I think it'll be 15, maybe 20 years before we see the types of technology that truly can be. When I meet with some of our LREs and they talk about how they're talking about these internal to their shops, it's these almost unicorn technologies, these non-emitting, dispatchable, fuel-assured technologies. And, I mean, we think of things like long-range duration batteries or small modular nuclear reactors as being those types of technologies. I do think it's 15 to 20 years before those are really commercialized. I do get the opportunity to be in various venues and talk to both who are those individuals and companies that are on the leading edge of these types of things and those that are maybe lagging behind. And it is sort of encouraging that I do hear about some of these like small modular nuclear reactors being in various stages of development and actually being tested today. So this is not theoretical technology. It's just not yet to the point where it can be commercialized. To your question about what level of risk should ratepayers perhaps take on? I'll readily admit I'm probably not qualified to offer you an opinion on that, but as I was sitting here thinking, I couldn't help but notice yesterday during the presentations from the director of the Economic Development Group, she put up a list of potential new major load sites, all the jobs and benefits that would come associated with those prospective projects in the state of Missouri. And at least two of those said, or at least according to the slide, I'm only coming if I can get 100% renewable energy. And that kind of struck me as like, okay, well, if that's one of your criteria, to say, in order for me to bring my project to your state, are there some things that as a regulator I might consider that, okay, maybe you might need to help us invest in some of these types of technologies and develop them in order for us to be able to meet your needs as a customer. Not all customer demands are created equal, right? You all know that. Whether I'm a residential customer or a manufacturing plant or a data center, I have different needs. And so I would say that getting creative with your rate design around helping meet the customer's needs and recognizing those differences might be something worth exploring.
All right, thank you. What role do you believe customer generation on the customer side of the meter will play in capacity? Do you factor in distributed energy, and obviously it's intermittent as well, so it's going to receive a low capacity factor, but do you factor that percentage in, and do you see that expanding in the future as a part of the complement?
Yeah, I'll start with this one and then turn it over to Bob. Yes, we do factor it in. Today, at least in the SPP footprint, it is not a meaningful amount of capacity. So today, it's reflected in our analysis as a reduction in the load that we're having to meet. With that said, so your follow-on question was around, do we expect it to grow into the future? Absolutely. FERC Order 2222 established the ability for these small behind-the-meter generators to aggregate themselves. And all of a sudden, what used to be kilowatts of capacity behind the meter starts looking like tens of megawatts, maybe even hundreds of megawatts. So we will absolutely have to account for those differently than what we have in the past. The rate of adoption that we might see in our footprint is still unknown, because there will still be there's going to be a cost to play in this game, right? So even as a behind-the-meter generator, you're still going to have to be able to perform in a way that we as the RTOs and the balancing authorities can have visibility and some level of controllability, dispatchability, if you will, of these types of resources. So I think that will help moderate a little bit of the pace that we see these types of technologies come online, at least to the extent that they would affect our resource adequacy decisions. But they're certainly coming. I think it's going to be like any other new technology. It'll probably develop on the coast first and then work its way into the middle.
Can I take a line from Roger Clark yesterday and just say ditto? No, but it is about the same answer. We actually believe we'll see a lot more aggregation on the distribution side than we will see on the transmission side, just because the rates, our wholesale rates are lower than the retail rates, and they have more opportunity to earn a return on the distribution side. So I think going forward, what's going to be very interesting is for the operators that actually keep the system on every day, the visibility into that behind the meter and the distribution side of things of what's going on, because the men and women that work down there will see load go and load come, and they won't be able to balance the system. So visibility will be a big factor as we go forward in this.
What do you determine for Winter Storm Uri and other events that we've seen as the most reliable technology that's on your footprint right now? What performed the best? Did wind perform? I know in Texas, they had some problems with some of their generators being able to maintain power. So as you sort of post-mortem that, we're a few years from that event, what resources showed the most reliable during that time?
I'll take a shot at it first if you want me to. I think it depends on the type of storm. When it's cold, we found that our up in the Minnesota area and North Dakota, when it's cold, below zero, some of the windmills didn't work because the grease would freeze. You also had wellhead freezes on your gas lines. In some of the storms, our wind performed unbelievable, and we utilized it to help other RTOs. And then the storm where the wind didn't perform, so we leaned on another RTO. Coal piles can freeze depending on how cold it is. So as we continue to learn about solar panels, as they ice over or snow over, what type of energy or capacity they're going to be able to produce at that time. So I don't think there's one silver bullet here. I think that goes back to a good mix of generation across the footprint. And I think it goes to the cooperation that we have with SPP, PJM, and all three of us working together, because as those storms move, we may be able to help each other across the country. And our continued work with SPP and JTIQ and other projects that make it easier to move power back and forth will protect us against that one resource. But all I think, and David may understand this better than I do, I think every resource is affected depending on what type of storm we're having.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You know, fortunately or unfortunately, no two events are the same, and that's what our operations team has said. When we go back and look at Uri, it was completely different than Elliott, even though the conditions were very similar. Is the pace of how these storms move across the country, how long they sit in any one given area, all of those play a factor into how well a certain technology will perform. Just as Bob indicated, we've had certain storms where wind performed tremendously well. We've had others where they didn't perform as well. Certainly Winter Storm Uri challenged the gas supply. I think our plant operators who operate gas plants have done a tremendous amount of work since Winter Storm Uri to help bolster the performance of those plants. As I mentioned, the performance-based accreditation policies that we've put in place are intended to help incentivize that type of proactive maintenance going forward. But one of the things I think is still a big uncertainty for all of us is the actual supply of gas. You can do all the plant maintenance you want on a plant, but if you can't actually get the fuel when you need it, it's not going to matter. And I know there's a lot of work going on in like NASB and federal coordination with the gas industry around those issues. But generally speaking, I don't know that I could really say that there's one type of technology that just you can count on more than another during a severe event.
This is my last question. You mentioned earlier in your opening that one of the reforms you want to do is have the folks in the queue already have their land in possession. And here in Missouri, we have a lot of stakeholders that participate in this, and one of the largest stakeholders are the landowners and the land rights advocates. What role can the RTO play from an educational standpoint, from an advocacy standpoint, to work with the agricultural groups and to work with the land right owners groups in helping understand that this reliability challenge that we're facing is directly correlated to our ability to move the power and in transmission, and help them become partners in the solution as opposed to opposition?
Thank you, Commissioner, for that question. That issue is directly the reason why we just issued this paper last week called Our Generational Challenge. It is written in a way, and we've challenged Commissioner Hahn can attest to this, the states, the members, the RTO staff. We had a staff meeting last week where we had an all-hands-on-deck staff meeting, all of SPP's employees together. We talked about using this as a way to go out into the community and get people to understand the challenge that all of us face in this energy transition that we're facing. Increasing demand, changing resource mix, the desire to retire legacy thermal generating plants. We need to add a lot of infrastructure, and we need to do it much faster than what we're able to do so today. So the idea is we need to all be delivering the same message, singing from the same tune, rather than backing into our corners and protecting our own interests. So, you know, back to this notion that reliability is a team sport, you have to agree that you're playing the same game, first of all. And so I think, so to your question, the role that the RTOs can play is really help, you pointed it out, in educating and being able to provide materials that our commissioners and our members can use to go out and talk to these constituents and to just be available to answer questions and to help all stakeholders appreciate the severity of the challenge that's before us. So that's really the approach that SPP is taking, and Bob, I'd love you to weigh in.
I agree on everything, and I think you started yesterday. I think yesterday was a good start on the education side of things. Not only did I see the utilities in the building, but I saw other elected officials, representatives from all across Missouri, and those are the type of seminars that are beneficial not only for the people sitting in front of me that have to vote on this stuff to understand what's going on, but it's also important to understand what policy is driven across the street, and also for the people that elect the people that are across the street. So I think yesterday was a great step in that process of moving that forward. So I commend everybody who put that together. That's the way to do it, and educate.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Commissioner Kolkmeyer?
Yes, thank you, Chair Hahn. I know we touched on this yesterday a little bit, but when I heard the Supreme Court decision on the Chevron, my very first thought was maybe we won't have to shut down all of these thermo plants. That was my first thought. So, is that any of your thought? That maybe this will push it out. Now, I realize that some of these are just aging out. Okay, I mean there's a life to every one of those, but the problem is we're not replacing them. Okay, that's as much a concern of mine as that we're not replacing them, and it's just like anything. I mean, sooner or later you got to buy a new car. Okay, well, sooner or later, you got to buy a new plant. Okay, so with that, I'll.
Sure. I'm an attorney, but MISO doesn't allow me to play one anymore, so I'll be careful how I answer this. I think it's going to have an effect. I just don't know what the effect is yet, right? So it's very new. I think you'll see some changes, but we don't know what those changes are and those impacts are. On the idea of talking about some of the plants that, you're absolutely right, Commissioner, some of the plants that we built 40, 50 years ago, when you look at what we're talking about in both places on accreditation and performing during those peak hours, may not be able to do that, and it's actually costing the ratepayer money, and it's better to retire those resources and replace those resources with either gas or whatever, because those will have a better attribute and be able to perform on those attributes that I talked about. Quick starting. The way we operate our large units is changing, not today, but in the future. They're not going to run 24/7 as they do today. They may run in the mornings and in the evenings, or when the wind or the solar or the batteries aren't there. So for the utilities to look to the future and how they're going to get compensated, which actually helps your ratepayers on capacity payments and energy payments, that's the future. So you're absolutely right on the retirement. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with Chevron and how it goes forward, how that affects both the Department of the environmental side of things and DOE.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I'm not an attorney, so I'm not even going to attempt to practice one. But I've been a part of a lot of conversations, internal and outside of SPP, asking the very same question: what's the effects of Chevron on our industry? And this question of EPA regulations comes up every time. And it seems like the people who do follow this, there's a general consensus that at minimum this will slow things down. I think lawyers, of course, will make a lot of money off of this. And so the challenges to the EPA regulations as they work their way through the court system will just take a lot of time. How much time that buys the utilities on their decisions about whether to invest in retrofitting a plant or retiring one, I don't know. But I do think it extends the timeline a little bit.
following on from Commissioner Kolkmeyer's question, I know a lot of the planning reserve margin requirement that was just changed was based upon everything that can run, must run. What are the RTOs doing to communicate with your members about not retiring plans just because they're fully depreciated and keeping them on the system as long as they're feasible? So if you could talk about your approaches, that would be helpful.
Sure. I think it gets back to the question you asked earlier about long-term visibility into what the capacity needs of the region are. Hopefully, our load responsible entities are taking away that from our conversations that the planning reserve margin is only going to increase from here based on everything that we see. So that means that unless you just absolutely have to get rid of a generator, or if you're able to replace that generator with comparable capacity, we really need you to hold on to it. And we do talk about it from an operational standpoint. We've already had this conversation this morning about the value of having a diverse fuel mix. And, you know, all storms are different, and being able to call on different technologies at different times when the system is stressed, we need it all. And I'll just tell you, from a grid operator perspective, we don't want to see anything go at this point. We understand that the decision to retire a particular generator is a very complex one, and so we don't see all of the factors that go into making that decision. But strictly from an operational standpoint, we don't want to see any megawatts go away. We want to hold on to them. And so I think for us, it can just continue to be messaging about where we're going with our planning reserve margin requirements, talking about the different technologies. Bob's already mentioned the attributes side of different technologies and how those are viewed differently. Making sure that our accreditation policies are, you know, really nailed down, that we're truly valuing different technologies in consistent with the actual reliability value that they provide. Is all the signals that we're sending to our members about what technologies we need.
Yeah, I'll just add, I agree. I just add that I think the MISO OMS, or the Organization of MISO States survey that we do each year, sort of sends that message to our load serving entities. Obviously, it's a snapshot, right? It's that day that the deadline for everybody to turn their data in. It's a snapshot, but it sends the right message to our load serving entities and our members that things are getting tighter. Can you delay that retirement? Can you look to invest a little bit more money into that retirement? Or if you're planning on retiring it, what are you going to replace it with? What attribute are you going to replace it with?
Thank you. I'm going to change subjects. Missouri is a SEAM state, and I know that both RTOs have committed to working differently, and I know that JTIQ is a product of that. But I'm really interested in three-party talks between MISO, AECI, and SPP. So I'm curious if you can give me any updates on three-party talks conversations for long-term planning purposes.
Sure.
I'll start with this one. We actually have three particular examples where we have been able to work with Associated on some joint transmission in the state of Missouri. You've already mentioned the JTIQ that we're working on with our colleagues at MISO. In addition to those, we have our ITP process ongoing right now that is expected to conclude in October of this year. We're expecting significant transmission expansion in the state of Missouri as a result of that analysis. In fact, I checked with our engineers just before this meeting. I expected a question around this to come up, and it's looking like we should have well over a dozen transmission projects, somewhere on the order of magnitude of around $700 million of transmission investment in or around the state of Missouri. All projects don't, source and sink in the state of Missouri, but there's significant investment coming from the SPP regional transmission planning process. You've already called out the fact that Missouri is unique in that it sits right on the seam between SPP MISO and AECI covers the vast majority of the state. So we pretty much can't build any transmission or authorize any transmission in our plans without coordination with our neighbors. And so of those dozen plus projects and $700 million or so of investment, most of those are going to require some conversations with Associated and MISO. Our planning teams do that as just a matter of practice when we know we've got a project that is going to either impact or depend on agreement on the neighboring provider. And so those conversations are going right now on those particular projects. Also, we have recently launched the preliminary development of planning scopes for joint studies with AECI and MISO as part of our normal JOA coordinated planning processes. So those are ongoing. And I guess I'd also point back out to one of the recent examples that we've had of where we've been able to work with our neighbors to get a project built into Missouri was the Wolf Creek to Blackberry project. That was a project that terminated outside of SPP's system. So we had to have AECI's authorization to proceed with that project, but it was the right thing to do. It was a project that benefited our region, benefited our customers in Missouri. And so we've always viewed these seams issues as not barriers that can't be overcome. In fact, another example is the Morgan Transformer project a few years ago. That was a project wholly on AECI's system, but it was the right project for SPP's customers and our ratepayers. So we reached out to AECI and said, hey, would you be willing to do this project on your system? We understand it's primarily for our benefit, and so we're willing to pay for it. But it's a matter of building those relationships and getting agreements with our neighbors that they're willing to entertain those types of creative solutions. And we've been successful at that. And so I want you to hear from me. We remain committed to those types of solutions to the benefit of our members and our customers.
Yeah, I'll start off by saying we are committed to definitely work with SPP and AECI. I think right now in Tranche 1 project, you have Ameren Transmission working with AECI to commit to finish that project, which is a very important project. We have made several visits now to AECI to visit with them about transmission planning, including with SPP, working together to try to figure out what are our next steps. It'll always come down to how we're going to pay for it. That's going to be the big issue, right? But I think we're both committed, and our teams are both committed to working to see what we can develop in that area between AECI, SPP, and MISO, and we'll continue to do that. You know, our planning teams meet very often. You may not see it, you may not hear about it, but there's a lot more coordination going on behind the scenes. I think one of the things that is a takeaway from this meeting is maybe we need to be a little bit more vocal about what we're doing behind the scenes, and that's something I will take back to my planning team, and I'm sure they'll take it back to their planning team to inform this commission on what some of the smaller projects or that may have great benefit to Missouri ratepayers that are actually getting accomplished in both processes.
That'd be great, and I know it was just mentioned the planning processes that are already used. This year in the SPP ITP, there are significant investments for Missouri that I think have been a long time coming, and I just want to say thank you to SPP, the leadership team, and the staff for coming up with those proposed solutions because they're going to make a huge difference for our ratepayers in the long term. But speaking of that, there was recently a line that was proposed in SPP and working with AECI that also had benefits for MISO. But I'm not sure that the SPP staff were willing to share those benefits potentially with MISO, and I had visited about it with SPP staff at the last RSC meeting, and they weren't sure exactly why those benefits couldn't be shared. Were you aware of this?
I'm not aware of that specific example, Chair Hahn. I do know in the past, we have had conversations with ACI and MISO when we're talking about various projects that we may be working on with one or the other, and the potential benefits that those projects may provide to the neighbor that we're directly working with, or even ancillary benefits that may apply to even a third party. So I'd say our historical practice has been that we have those conversations. I'm just not aware of this particular one.
Maybe we can visit after with our staff to clarify. One other topic that's really come up as of late, was already mentioned, I think, in opening comments, but is interregional transfers. You know, FERC is talking about it. I'm talking about it with fellow commissioners. There's even recently a group that I joined to kind of convene and talk about it. But my understanding is currently we have limited transfer capability between the RTOs and limited flow gates. What are we doing about it?
You want me to start?
Yeah, you can take this one.
I appreciate that. Thanks. Flow gates are always a very interesting topic in both our RTOs, both on our PJM and SPP seam. I wish I could yield to a friend from Ameren Transmission back there, but I'll go ahead and take a shot at this one. I think our staff is committed to look at a lot more interregional planning after we complete our Tranche 2.1. Our staff has been very overwhelmed trying to get those $23 billion worth of projects through and completed, which will benefit ratepayers here in Missouri and across our footprint. But there does need to be, we have kicked off an interregional study with PJM. And we will work on kicking off one with SPP coming forward. I think when we visited before, one of our transmission planners mentioned that. And we will continue to look to do something in 2025, we hope, to kick off some studies to work with SPP to try to find something. Don't expect a lot to come out of the PJM MISO study. I think there'll be some low-hanging fruit that we can grab and help that transfer capabilities. But we definitely need to look to our west to try to prove those transfer capabilities as we move forward.
Yeah, first off, transfer capability between regions can certainly be viewed as like an insurance policy. We saw that during Winter Storm Uri and Elliott. So first I will acknowledge that the transfer capability isn't unlimited, but it's not a really small amount either, as was demonstrated through Winter Storm Uri. In particular, I think we were in excess of 6,000 megawatts being imported from MISO during that time. So that was tremendously helpful to us. We were really able to limit the exposure we had from the severe conditions of Uri because of that. I've also been involved in the NERC analysis, and so part of the industry who is helping NERC develop the study and really helping them formulate the messaging around what the study actually provides. What's the value of it? And to me, one of the things you first have to agree on is, well, one, how do you measure transfer capability? There's not really consensus on even how you measure it, but what we know, based on experience, is there's at least 6,000 to 7,000 megawatts that can be moved between SPP and MISO. So one, you have to agree on how do you measure it, and then two, you have to then decide on, well, how much is enough? One, ratepayers can't afford to gold plate the system. We don't want to gold plate the system. So how much incremental amount would be valuable? So one of the things we are doing, and we actually did it as part of JTIQ, is taking a look at the transmission that we're already planning for and saying, well, how much incremental transfer capability do you get as a result of this transmission? And when we looked at the JTIQ, it wasn't significant, but it was, I mean, it was a couple hundred megawatts of additional transfer capability. That can mean the difference between having to turn the lights off during a severe event or not. And so our view is, as it's just an incremental value of transmission that we're committed to looking at as we evaluate all of these projects. The ones that we're talking about in the state of Missouri, I would expect there to be some incremental value to transfer capability as a result of those. They sit on the seam. You would expect it to be able to enable more transfers between SPP, AECI, and MISO. So we'll be taking a look at that.
I'm glad he brought up the point that we do share back and forth, and that's important.
Great, thank you. This is more for MISO, but it's, I think, the last set of questions that I have right now. There's a lot of interest in the resource planning auction, and that slide that you showed earlier is the highlight of our concern and really the reason why we also need to convene on resource adequacy. Almost every time I feel like I'm trying to get what we can do about it, my answers and solutions are limited. So with that, what do you think I can do or we can do as regulators to shore up that capacity shortfall, and what can MISO do?
So let's start with MISO, what MISO can do, because so we are working with our transmission owners to see how we can improve the capacity import limits. I mean, that's one thing that affected that. Obviously, Tranche 1 and Tranche 2 will actually help some of that capacity imports. This year, Tranche 2 will be not in the model for our resource planning auction, but it will be for the years coming after that, assuming that the board approves those projects in December. I think the idea of the message that we've been saying, and they heard me say today and yesterday, let's take a deep breath and not retire what we need to keep the generation on to meet that local clearing requirement. I think the idea of having you look to see to make sure the resources that have completed our generation interconnection queue are getting steel in the ground, which will provide more capacity and more energy to this area. Those are some of those I think is a combination of the stuff that we can do, and continue to have your staff, which does an unbelievable job, attend our stakeholder process meetings in September. We will be rolling out our capacity import and capacity export limits. Ask questions, see if they've increased, and their time. And I know your staff is unbelievable that helps at MISO providing feedback to those things. So all those studies are coming out for next year, and we will keep you, I'm committed to keep you appraised, as your staff will be, on where we are with our capacity import limits and capacity export limits. I think we all see the issue. I think the last couple days, there's been some good communication, and I think that communication needs to continue to help solve this problem moving forward.
Thank you. It wasn't a loaded question or anything like that.
No, not at all. I mean, it's okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Appreciate it. I think that concludes my questions.
Chair Hahn, thank you. Any further bench questions before we throw it open to other parties to ask questions? All right, I'm not hearing anything. Let me first see if staff has any questions, and for staff and anybody else, if you'll please come to a microphone if you do have questions, so people on WebEx can follow along. So any questions from members of the staff? Mr. McKinney?
Adam McKinney with the commission. A couple of follow-ups on some of the specific information on MISO Zone 5. I understand we talk a lot about zonal performance, and we don't talk a lot about individual actor performance. To the extent we want to shore up, where we are, can you talk about the ability of us or other actors to see individual utility performance within the planning resource auction?
Are you talking, and Adam, I apologize, are you talking about individual data or what?
individual utility data?
Yeah, so a lot of that is confidential. That we cannot share with our individual utilities. Obviously, the idea of looking at resource planning or IRPs going forward is something that would maybe help look at that. That's a decision that we heard about yesterday and what the legislature or the commission would do. But if there are data requests provided to MISO and we can provide that data without confidential issues being breached, we would be happy to provide that data to the commission.
I'm trying to figure out if you're making me an offer, then you won't be able to fulfill it.
I don't know your request,
If-
and I would have to ask my attorneys on if I could provide that data or not. I apologize on that.
I know,
I'm not
but-
trying to be smart about it, but really, I don't want to commit myself to something that I can't fulfill.
Okay, I just don't want you to give me an answer that's meaningless is my problem, because it's difficult to know where we're going in the future if we don't know where we've been and we don't know the performance of individual actors within our zone.
I'll make this commitment, Adam, that I would be happy to later in the next coming weeks to schedule something with our team that does the planning resource auction, and let's talk through what we can provide and what we can't provide. And that's the best I can do today, Adam.
I appreciate that. Switching to capacity import limit, as multiple commissioners said, we're near a seam. That's not new. But putting a pin in interregional planning, do we get fewer transmission lines coming in and out of Missouri because we're near a seam?
I don't believe that'd be the case. I think in our long-range transmission planning, I think there has been a lot of 345s moving through the in Missouri. I couldn't, without looking at a map or having the data in front of me on what type of projects your TOs in Missouri have requested through either the MTEP process or our process that we do in LRTP. It's sort of a bottom-up approach. If the transmission owners bring us the projects and they work and there's something that fits into the planning process and is good for the ratepayers, we will approve those in MTEPs. But I can honestly say we don't say, let's not look at Missouri and not give them anything because they're on the seam. That's the farthest thing that we would ever do at MISO. We look for the best, most affordable transmission to help deliver the lowest cost energy to the ratepayers.
So when we look at Tranche 4,
Sure.
potentially connecting Missouri to the south,
Yes.
why is that so far back in line?
A valid question that I cannot answer. I think the build-out in the south would have to come to support, and I'm not a transmission planner, so I'm taking a stab at this, but I will get you the actual information. I think not only do we have to build the infrastructure in the north and the central, but we also have to build the infrastructure in the south to make sure that value that we connect is something that will be utilized and benefit all ratepayers and customers in the north and central and south regions. The south region was built a little differently than the north and the south on the way they did transmission. So as you see in our MTEPs in the last couple years, the South has put a lot of projects in, and they're basically doing a lot of the building already to provide that infrastructure. So as they continue to do that, we'll continue to evaluate how fast and how quickly we will move the north-south connection.
So I hear it's not your fault, it's their fault.
It's nobody's fault. I think it's just the way we have, MISO has prioritized the delivery of the steps that we would like to produce. Obviously, stakeholders at MISO can provide feedback anytime at our long-range transmission planning, at the PAC, to say that maybe we should look at moving Tranche 4 to Tranche 2 and at 2.2. So I hear your feedback. I will let the team know that we should reevaluate or take a look at moving Tranche 4 quicker.
Okay, just one more question. David, I'm not going to let you off the hook. I took your discussion when Chair Hahn asked about three-party talks as we should be happy with what we get and three-party talks aren't needed. Is that a fair characterization?
No, I wouldn't characterize it that way. I think we need to understand what we want to get out of multi-party conversations. And Adam, I appreciate your engagement in all of our joint planning activities. As you know, we've had limited success in years past when we don't have clear objectives that we're trying to meet or problems that we're trying to solve when we get together. The first iteration of the MISO SPP CSP to me is a great example of that, where we said, let's get together and build a joint model and run our traditional studies and see what pops out of it. And I think that was frustrating for staff and stakeholders and regulators alike. So when we look now at what we've been able to be really successful at, JTIQ is a great example where we said, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Now, how do we get the relevant parties, including the RTOs and the stakeholders, together to solve that problem? We can be really successful that way. So I think if there is a known issue that AECI, SPP, and MISO share together, because that's what led to the success of JTIQ. We shared the same issue. We said, let's work on it together. Then let's get those three-party conversations going to resolve it. So that's my commitment, is I'm not foreclosing the door to three-party conversations. I just want to have an objective going into those conversations of a problem that we're trying to solve jointly.
Well, I will tell you, when I'm at the SPP AECI meeting and SPP staff tells me they won't give me MISO numbers for estimates for benefits, that makes me just want to submit the exact same projects into the SPP MISO process so I get the MISO benefits. So that seems to me like a clear area where three-party talks could benefit. So
I took Chair Hahn's question earlier. I have made myself a note, and I will follow up on that particular item. I don't understand why we're not willing to share that information, but I will follow up.
okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any further staff questions? Ms. Eubanks, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. There was a comment about 2.3 gigawatts in your interconnection queue with signed GIAs. Can you talk about what percentage of projects that are actually have signed generation interconnection agreements come to fruition? Is there concern there? Because there were a lot of comments about steel in the ground, especially
Yeah.
what the commission can do.
Yeah, there is concern. Zoning changes are a big factor. Resources not being delivered. They could be waiting for a PPA and not ever get that purchase power agreement. There are risks, obviously, until those units are built and on our system. So yes, there are still those risks there. I don't have the percentage of that because it would all depend on each individual unit.
Yeah, and I'll just add that the percentage of generators, once they sign an interconnection agreement, the percentage of those moving forward is much higher, which makes sense, right? That if they've lasted through the entirety of the interconnection process and agreed that there are certain costs that they're willing to incur, so much so that they're willing to sign an interconnection agreement and perhaps put at risk all of the money that they've put up to date, there's a generally good likelihood that they're going to move forward. But as Bob pointed out, there are things that come up, and we've seen it just changing project economics, supply chain issues, land zoning issues, as he brought up, permitting issues that occur after the fact, that all put projects in jeopardy of being able to be successful. And it goes without saying, but a large part of the issues with the interconnection queues is a result of late-stage withdrawals, which is why SPP, and I know MISO, a lot of the queue reform has been targeted at minimizing those, but when they occur, they are really problematic to processing the interconnection queues, because now you have to go back and look at the effects of that withdrawal on everything else that you've already processed. So we really need to get to a point that once the customer signs an interconnection agreement, it is near certain that they're going to move forward.
Any further staff questions? Mr. Stallman, when you're ready.
Michael Stallman, staff. I've long had a question on whether treating capacity as a homogeneous good in some of the capacity markets can send a confusing or inappropriate price signal to other marketers. MISO in particular, yes.
Wow. I have to think about that one. One more time of the question. That's interesting.
So if treating capacity as a homogeneous good for when we do these spot market prices, would that send a confusing or an inappropriate price signal to other marketers?
I need to get the answer to that question. I don't have it. I don't want to address something that I can't address, but I will get with you afterwards and get that question answered and get it back to you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any further staff questions? Mr. Lubert?
Hi, Jay Lubert. I think this is probably a follow-up to one of Adam's questions, and maybe it's just clarification for my own lack of understanding. But he talked about looking at fewer transmission projects, or seemingly fewer transmission projects, with Missouri being a seam state. And I was wondering if it's possible that Missouri being a seam state results in fewer customers kind of receiving that benefit, and therefore that magnitude maybe gets minimized because you're on the edge, right? Is that
It
is that
could
fair?
be, and I want to make sure we don't at MISO do transmission planning saying, "Oh, Missouri is on seam." We're not going to look that way. I mean,
But I think, could that be the result of that being the case, right?
it could be potentially. I don't know the answer to that, but it could be a good point, and maybe Dave.
Yeah, let me jump in on this one. Well, so I think there is some validity to the observations you're making. I think that's what you're pointing out, is all this planning takes place, and generally speaking, transmission is not coming to the state of Missouri, right? And I go back to the comment I made to Adam on another question that he had asked, is that transmission planning is all about solving for a particular objective. And generally speaking, when the RTOs do regional planning, they're looking at projections of new generation that's being built, where is load growth occurring, where's generation retiring, things of that nature. They're building out these long-term models, but it's the solution to the planning study itself is to further the efficiency and reliable operations of that RTO. That's the purpose of the regional planning process, right? So the question then becomes, where's the generation being sited? So you have to look at, is generation being sited in Missouri? There is some, but I think the data would show that the vast majority of the generation that's being built in the SPP region is being built in other states. So now the process is looking at, how do I move that energy from the new generation to load within the footprint, and where is that load growth occurring? So all of those factors, I think, come into play where the transmission is really being cited to increase reliability, reduce congestion, to benefit the operation of the RTO. And so I think there's probably some truth to the observations you're making in that being on the scene almost says that the transmission is really needed to reduce the congestion from where the generation is being built to serving the load within the footprint. Hopefully I'm making sense. So if you really want to see transmission getting built along the seam, you then have to say, what am I trying to build that transmission for? So I go back to the JTIQ as an example. It was targeted at addressing seams issues that were permeating the interconnection queue process, right? Chair Hahn asked a question about interregional transfer capability earlier. If you had a policy decision that says we want to increase the transfer capability between SPP, ACI, and MISO by 20%, just throwing out a random number, you can design a study to do that, and you will identify transmission along the seam that serves that purpose. So the question really becomes, at what purpose are you trying to plan the transmission?
Yeah, I think you got to my follow-up, actually, which is, I think you both talked about during the major winter storms, I want to say it was somewhere around 8 gigawatts of transference, right, between several of them, and we're here talking about resource adequacy, right? And I think there's been a lot of discussion about kind of the having a combination of different resources. SPP is very wind heavy. You talked about the MISO queue being nearly entirely solar or vast majority. And so my question is, when you're looking at those kind of those projects, are you factoring in that transference capability from a resource adequacy standpoint and the ability to kind of meet those peak time periods? Because I do think that gives a little bit more credence to looking at projects along the seams and seeing if that makes sense. And if I think you mentioned that it's difficult to quantify, right? And so if that's the case, is there something that can get to that end or look at a potential way to improve that process so that we can kind of meet two benefits from looking at it, right?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I'm going to answer what I think you're really getting at is whether or not there's a role to play of the RTO's planning processes of being able to bolster resource adequacy by building transmission that would allow the regions to take advantage of each other's resources. Is that kind of the flavor behind your question?
I guess the question is, I hear both representatives talking about how important resource adequacy is, right? Yep. And how adding more resources is going to be important, and having a variety of different types of resources is important. But then the attributes that we're talking about, what I hear is add more natural gas, right? Because it's looking at adding something that ramps up quickly and is reliable, or adding just a lot of other resources.
Yep.
And so that's why I'm trying to understand if that process of kind of the combined planning, if it's looking at that ability to transfer resources when that capacity is most needed in other areas, is if that can be optimized, right?
Yeah, the processes do look at the ability to transfer energy first and foremost. Capacity is a different animal, and it comes down to risk management and the role that resource adequacy plays in the RTO's ability to keep the lights on. So we talked about it like at the very beginning of the workshop, that resource adequacy is about the grid operator, so in this case SPP or MISO, being able to count on a generator to be there when it's needed most. And right, wrong, or indifferent, that has always came along with it the understanding that two grid operators can't be counting on that generator, the same generator, to be there when both may need it the most. So it's always been, at least in SPP's view, very risky to say, let me count on generators in my neighbor's region in order for me to count on being able to keep the lights on.
Yeah, let me rephrase then. I think what I'm asking is, when you're looking at potential benefits of a transmission project, is that ancillary benefit of the potential for that 8,000 megawatt transfer that was absolutely beneficial to SPP during Uri, right? And I think you had a follow-up storm that MISO got some benefit too, right? Is that being considered, or are there ways to improve how you might quantify what those benefits could be?
Yeah.
So that you're looking at projects where you're kind of bolstering that seam or that interconnection.
Thank you. Now I understand the question a little better. And I would say, yes, JTIQ was like the first example of that, where we quantified the transfer capability from those projects. Those projects weren't targeted at doing just that, right? So we just said, what's the additional benefit we would get? I think that's going to be a practice that we have just going forward. I mentioned this earlier in a response, that as we're looking at projects, particularly near the seam, we will ask the question, what do these projects do for transfer capability? Not that we're going to count on it, but just knowing what does it do, such that when we get into an event, we'll kind of know, are we better off than where we were during the last event? It's going to be difficult to assign a dollar value to that, because in order to do that, you have to count on it for capacity. Like the Winter Storm Uri and Elliott transfers, those were non-firm transfers. They weren't counted on per se going into the event. We were really fortunate that they were there, and we're thankful they were there. But we can't, well, historically we haven't planned the system around those transfers being there. But we do want to capture the value to the extent they're there.
And just puff that, I think JTIQ is a great pattern that both MISO and SP will follow in the future as we continue to develop other projects that we potentially could have on the seams. We're using that same sort of technique and looking at what we learned from JTIQ on the PJM side also, in the Michigan, Indiana area, as we look at it. So I think lessons learned from JTIQ, that's the biggest one. How do we utilize both resources efficiently?
And then, I think unrelated, maybe it is related, for SPP, I think yesterday there was some discussion about a difference between a summer resource adequacy requirement and, I want to say, I think the way it was phrased as a winter obligation that may not have a financial kind of tie to it. And I was going to see if there's any discussion around that, or if you can point me to the right direction. Maybe it's a conversation afterward.
Yeah, I think I can address this one fairly quickly. So all of the requirements are in attachment AA of our tariff, and I'm happy to point you to that. Today, our resource adequacy construct has a summer planning reserve margin requirement. And what that means is we require all of our LREs to submit to us basically a test that they have enough capacity to cover their load plus the requirement. That only applies today in the summer. The consequences of not meeting your planning reserve margin for the summer today is a deficiency payment. Right? We actually have on file at FERC pending approval to implement that same construct for the winter. Now, that's not the separate winter planning reserve margin that was just approved at the RSC last week, but this would just apply the same deficiency payment construct to the winter season. It doesn't exist today. It's just an obligation. That's what was meant by, there's a tariff obligation that says you should have enough capacity in the winter, but we don't apply a deficiency payment today. We will if FERC approves the filing that's at FERC today.
That helps.
Okay,
Thank
gotcha.
you.
All right, thank you. Any further questions from staff?
One more for me. Chair Hahn asked a question about the need for timing of certainty around the planning reserve margin and accreditation for load-serving entities. And I know we heard from SPP on that, but I think for both MISO and SPP, can you talk about how you do engage with your load-serving entities about changes to accreditation and planning reserve margins?
Sure. I'll start off by saying that last year we had roughly 500 stakeholder meetings that we take input in from everybody. We, over our accreditation filing that we have, I would assume there's probably at least 10 to 15 meetings that stakeholders can input. We try to build a consensus, and I don't mean to talk with my back. I'll just talk this way, and I apologize for talking with my back to you. So there is not anything that we file at FERC generally that doesn't have large, oh. With the Black's Law Dictionary holding up the podium, I like it. It's a good use of the Black's Law Dictionary, by the way. Back to your question. So everything we do at MISO that we have to file at FERC, we have either workshops, input from feedback from all our stakeholders. We work with our load-serving entities. One part of my role and the people that work for me is to reach out to our stakeholders to make sure they understand what is happening. You have two wonderful people here that's sitting next to you that attend not only the PAC and planning advisory committees, but also resource adequacy meetings. On top of that, we spend a lot of time at OMS working through our accreditation and working through our planning reserve and what we do. When we moved to seasonal approach in our PRA, we took years to get that accomplished. But one thing is important, that we work with our organization, MISO States, because resource adequacy is their responsibility. And so how we change accreditation not only affects the people that are sitting behind you that are the load-serving entities, but it also affects what you look at when you take it CPCNs or other important decisions that the commission makes. So there is plenty of stakeholder involvement. Anybody can do it. Anybody can come to it. And our board is also open. You can come to our board meetings and address our board about concerns. So hopefully that answered your question. And thank you. I'll move away from the podium now.
Yeah, actually, that does feel better. Yeah. So very similar to MISO, we have a very open, robust stakeholder process. And as it relates to resource adequacy, it all starts with our supply adequacy working group. That's a group that is tailor-made to focus on resource adequacy issues. And so they help us scope out our LOLE study each year whenever we do that. And that includes how we're going to do the projections for the longer-term view as well. As I mentioned earlier, the study we just completed did have a 2029 view in it, and so our next one will look out even further. Beyond the supply adequacy working group, I mentioned earlier the REAL team, the Resource and Energy Adequacy Leadership Team, made up of regulators and board members and stakeholders. And then, of course, the Regional State Committee has ultimate authority, actual 205 directing us to file certain things related to resource adequacy, and ultimately goes to our board. So that would be the venues to get involved in resource adequacy issues in SPP.
All right, thank you. Any further staff questions? All right, seeing none, any public council questions?
Hi, good morning. Just before I begin, I want to thank you both for taking the time to come out here and to answer all these questions and inform and educate us about this. Has been very, very helpful and greatly appreciate it. So I have, I think, just one simple question, and I'm going to turn it over to my partner here. My question concerns the interconnection queue. You obviously talked about the strides you're making to clear up that, and that sounds really commendable. I'm curious, if you had a load-serving entity come before you with a request for a project that was going to be a dispatchable generation, kind of like a combined cycle, is there any possibility right now for that entity to receive a preference in the queue, for example, to move up in the queue past, or is it stuck on first come, first serve?
There are avenues available. So let me start with just the typical queue process, right? A new generator going into the queue, there is currently not a way for a generator to get preferential treatment, queue jump if you will. We've had a lot of conversations in the SPP stakeholder forums, even as recently as last week about that issue, because of the intense focus on resource adequacy. Like, could we find a way such that an LRE who is trying to meet their resource adequacy requirements could somehow get a preferential spot in the queue or a separate study or what have you? And we haven't been able to get consensus within our community to advance that idea. And in fact, we think it would be dead on arrival at FERC. With that said, beyond the standard queue processes, our customers have gotten really good at taking advantage of some of the other tools available to them in the tariff. One of those being the generator replacement process. Bob mentioned that one earlier. If you have a retirement of a coal plant, just by way of example, you can take advantage of that existing site. You don't even have to build at that site. You just have to connect at the same point on the grid. So you can build a generator a few miles down the road, build a lead line to the same point on the grid, and take advantage of that interconnection site. And you don't have to go through the interconnection queue to do that. Now, you are limited to, well, one limit I've already mentioned is it's the same POI, but you're also limited in the same amount of interconnection capacity. So if the existing coal plant was 500 megawatts, the new plant can't exceed 500 megawatts either, or at least it would be limited to that amount unless you went through the queue to get the excess capacity. So that's one way. Surplus interconnection service is another one. That's where you have an existing point of interconnection with one or more generators there, but maybe they don't take advantage of their interconnection capacity all the time. Take a wind farm, for example. We've already talked about on average during the summer that maybe they're about 15%, right? So you've got a 100 megawatt wind farm. Maybe I want to add a battery. Maybe I want to add a gas turbine there, whatever. Those two generators can reach an agreement that says as long as the capacity never exceeds the amount that that original generator had, they can add more generators there and just not exceed that limit. Those are the two that come to mind. Maybe there's another one.
So absolutely, those are the exact same that we have. We do have a provisional GI if you want to take that risk, but that risk says you connect and you don't know what the costs are going to be once the queue is completed. So you could tie on, it's a study. There may be a little bit of limit. You may not be able to utilize the 500 or 600 megawatts, depending on what the system can handle. But if you're willing to write that, have basically a blank check to say, we don't know what your interconnection costs are going to be, but you could put that on the system, you're welcome to it. And it's not just for gas, it's for non-thermal resources too. Any resource can take advantage of any of the things we all talked about.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. I said I had one question, and something you mentioned jogs a question I had. The 2.3 gigawatts, I think that you had kind of identified. Is that nameplate, or is that after the accreditation?
Nameplate.
That's what I thought. And I know that you mentioned obviously changes in the performance-based accreditation happening at MISO, and it looked like that was a 2028, 2029 sort of for that to be implemented. Is that it's going to be implemented all at once, or is it a kind of a stepwise?
So no, it's implemented. It's implemented 2829. Knock on wood that FERC approves our accreditation filing. We did have some accreditation filing that has been approved by FERC that is actually in for thermal resources called Schedule 53 that accredits the resources on presently, and you see those accreditations built into the system now in our PRA. We're now incorporating everything into the new way we're going to look at resources in 28, 29, as long as FERC approves that.
And is SPP making any changes to its performance-based accreditation systems?
Yeah, our performance-based accreditation policy is still pending at FERC. We were actually hoping we would have gotten an order by now. So until that's approved, we won't have certainty as to what our performance-based accreditation policy will look like. And I was trying to look up when we had set the effective date of that. It looks like it would be effective for the summer of 26. Yeah. Thanks, Kim.
All right, thank you very much. That was the last of my questions, I promise, but I had, like I said, just a few from my partner.
I want to add my appreciation for you guys coming and answering questions, being willing to sit through all of this. My question's mostly for you. You showed on your PowerPoint in Missouri how we would be at a deficit for the requirement. Most of us in the room knows that area is served by Ameren. Does that necessarily mean that Ameren as a company has that deficit?
The answer to that question is no. There are a lot of other load-serving entities. Yep.
Or is it-
Yep, no problem. Excuse me. There are a lot of other load-serving entities and that make up of Zone 5 also, so it's just not Ameren.
And I think I know the answer to this question, but I want to hear it from you. Through your resource adequacy auction and so forth, can Ameren acquire, or an entity in Missouri, doesn't have to be, acquire capacity from Illinois or one of your other zones?
Sure. So I think I'm going to answer your question, but if I don't, let me know. So there are 2 steps in our PRA. First, you have to meet your local clearing requirement within Zone 5. That means there must be enough generation located in Missouri to meet that requirement, the local clearing requirement. After you meet your local clearing requirement, you can import, as long as you have import capabilities, to meet your reserve margin. So once you meet your LCR, you can get, in mainly Zone 4, 5, and 6, which is Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri, import from Zone 1, 2, and 3, which is Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Wisconsin area. That's mainly where the excess capacity is coming from. If you look at our PRA charts, you can see that.
So Ameren has capacity in Iowa and Illinois. Those are different zones, is that correct?
You can bring in capacity from anywhere you possibly can be. You can actually, if you have firm service, buy capacity out of SPP or PJM or even AECI if you have transmission that is firm. As long as you meet your local clearing requirement, you could bring in whatever you want from wherever it is, as long as you have transmission service from that area to Zone 5.
Okay, thank you. I
Not a
appreciate your
problem.
answer.
And you know, happy to educate. Happy to, you have my contact information. Happy to spend some time with your team to understand everything you need. A good MISO 101, happy to do that. I'm sure SPP would be doing the same. Anything we can do to help educate staff and everybody here is something we look forward to doing.
Thank you, we appreciate that.
Thank you. Any further public council questions? Any questions from any utilities? Going once, going twice. Any questions from anyone else before we see if the bench has any further questions or closing remarks? All right. Madam Chair?
I think everyone said it today, but can't tell you how thankful we are that you're here. And you know, you had no idea what subjects we might ask about, but I have to say you are very well prepared for all of them. So I just appreciate your level of knowledge and expertise, and on the things that you know, we'll be looking for follow-ups and be working together to solve some of these problems. So again, just thank you, appreciate you being here. And moving forward, you know, this is the first time we've done this, and we'll see, following other states, they do it quarterly. I don't know if that's exactly the right operating rhythm for us, but we'll figure it out and we'll be in contact with you. But thanks again.
Chair Hahn, thank you. Any closing remarks? Commissioner Coleman, anything? Commissioner Holzman?
Thank you, Judge. So I imagine if somebody was watching this on TV today or on YouTube and had no idea, you know, what we were talking about, because it's you know, pretty complicated. It's its own language, a lot of terminology, a lot of acronyms. But the one thing that they would be interested in is, are we going to be able to keep the lights on? You know, are we going to be able to keep the refrigerators running? And I think when we break it down to the basic question, what can we do to ensure that they don't have to worry about that? And I opened with saying, you know, I hope it's, you know, 3 years that we get on a path where we don't have to worry about this in 5. That may be optimistic given, you know, the complexities and the challenges we face. But without these conversations, we know we won't get there. And so, like Chair Hahn said, and I want to thank her, you know, it was really under her leadership that put yesterday together and today as well. And it's going to take that kind of leadership to continue the discussion where we can actually see steel on the ground. So I appreciate you guys being here, and let's keep talking about it, and so we don't have to talk about it. Thanks so much.
Commissioner Kolkmeyer?
I'll just be brief and say thanks for coming. A conversation that we've all needed. I was very impressed with our staff and OPC, the questions that they engaged with as well. So I think this was beneficial to everyone. So thanks again.
Any further bench questions or bench remarks? No, I'm good. All right. All right. Thank you very much. And that will conclude today's public meeting. Thank you very much for attending.